Let's go ahead and get started. Well, thank you all first, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate everybody for showing up and hanging out with us. Today we've got an interesting discussion. How did misinformation impact the 2024 election? We're going to break it down. We're going to talk about it. So very excited today to have Abdiaziz Ahmed join us from the Brennan Center for Justice. I won't go into their backgrounds. They'll give you a short bio as much as they would like in their opening statements. He's joined by Chris McIsaac of the R Street Institute as well. And yeah, we're just gonna have a little discussion here about misinformation in the 2024 election. So how this is gonna break down is I've given 15 minutes to each speaker to do an opening statement. And then we're just gonna have a really free-flowing conversation where the audience can ask questions. I might pop a couple questions in. I want you guys to just have open discussion, however you guys want to engage. So yeah, just really casual and looking forward to a good conversation. Um, so, Abdiaziz, if you wanted to go ahead and get started, I think we're ready. So, thanks again for everyone for joining, and yeah, here we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Spence, and thank you everybody for joining us. So by way of introduction, my name is Abdiaziz Ahmed. I work at the Brennan Center for Justice. I'm a tech policy strategist, and I primarily focus on the intersection of tech, democracy, election security. And before that, I spent a few years at Amazon, working as counsel on the public policy team there. And so I think this is a timely discussion we're having. And I think as we reflect on the 2024 election, there's one pressing question, which I've heard now in my work here at the Brennan Center, which is, how did generative AI impact the integrity of the elections, the integrity of our democratic process? I actually wrote a recent article for the Brennan Center, and it's on the Brennan Center's website, titled "Gauging the AI Threat to Free and Fair Elections." And so we kind of examined this very issue we're talking about today, analyzing the role AI played during the election, and also the implications for future electoral integrity. And so, as we all know, I think the stakes were incredibly and undeniably high. AI tools capable of creating, fake videos, synthetic audio, fabricated news articles had become more accessible and sophisticated, I think, than ever before. And so this obviously raised alarms about the potential for viral deepfakes confusing voters, AI generated disinformation campaigns spreading falsehoods at scale. And then also malicious actors undermining trust in the democratic institutions that we hold dear. And so I think with the election obviously having concluded, it's crucial to assess what transpired and what lessons we carry forward to safeguard future elections. But I also think it's not just about, the confusion or what happened, but about confidence. If voters can't trust or see what they hear, how can they participate meaningfully in our elections? And so I think the first point I want to make is that, the warnings were serious and not overblown. I think, to be clear, real AI related election threats materialized in 2024. From some of our work, we know we saw AI generated robocalls impersonating, President Biden during the New Hampshire primary, telling voters not to vote. We saw deep fake videos of political figures saying things they never said, circulating across social media. And then we also saw AI created campaign materials, fake flyers, meme style images designed to confuse or suppress voters. And so generative AI didn't replace misinformation. I think it supercharged it. And what I mean by that is what used to take and require money and expertise now took a few minutes and a free website. It really democratized the misinformation space, made it possible for almost anybody, not just well-funded actors, to take deceptive content and then to really spread it quickly. And so, yes, the threat environment, I think, changed. It became faster, harder to monitor in real time. I think the second point I want to make is that the impact was serious, but it wasn't catastrophic. And that's also important to ground our conversation which is that the most extreme scenarios, which folks had really envisioned to be very plausible, full-scale election disruptions, mass voter confusion, these things didn't occur. We didn't really see deep fakes going viral at the national level and shifting voter behavior. We didn't really see widespread AI-based attacks on election infrastructure itself. And we didn't really see kind of last-minute synthetic content driving panic at the polls. And so I think it's important to really assess what explains the gap between the fear and the outcome, on why that worst didn't happen. From my perspective, I think there was more public awareness than in previous cycles. We'd kind of been hearing about, political deepfakes for years. Many approached viral media more skeptically, especially during the final stretch of the campaign, in the sense that it even became a refrain. Somebody would see a video and the question like, is this AI or not? Right. So there's a level of kind of literacy and public awareness that came to fruition. I think secondly, elections officials and civic groups, civil society groups were more prepared. So I think there were warning systems, disinformation tracking teams, playbooks for dealing with synthetic contents. And in some states, election officials partnered with researchers and platforms, tech platforms, to flag and respond to false narratives more quickly than in 2020. And then finally, we saw some proactive policy responses, albeit very uneven. And so after the Biden robocalls, which I discussed, the ones on the eve of the New Hampshire primary, I think the FCC classified AI-generated voices in robocalls as illegal under existing law, which is a rare and fast regulatory move. States like Minnesota and Washington had already passed legislation targeting deceptive deepfakes in elections. And I think that's kind of been the hot legislative push, and something at the Brennan Center we're kind of thinking through how to, think about legislation not just as political deepfakes, and having a kind of a more comprehensive AI and misinformation agenda. But I think there's legal challenges, which are, which are really the elephant in the room. Are these First Amendment? Are these respectful and compliant with the First Amendment? And there's real enforcement limitations. And so even though, those challenges exist, those laws help draw lines in the sand and kind of set a bit of a blueprint. And I think finally, to be honest and frank, we were a bit fortuitous. I think foreign actors may have chosen not to escalate. I think coordinated disinformation campaigns and domestic campaigns may not have fully materialized. But with that being said, I don't think the risks have passed. I think only that this time they didn't break through at scale. And so what does this mean going forward? And this is kind of where I want to take this conversation and wrap up, this opening statement is, I think it's important to recognize AI is now firmly part of the election threat landscape. And the tools are only getting better, faster, cheaper, harder to detect. And so I think by 2026 and 2028, we can expect synthetic media, AI-generated content to be even more convincing and even harder for voters, journalists, even folks in civil society who specialize in this work to spot without technical help. I think secondly, reactive strategies aren't enough. And so I think there's this big push on fact-checking. We can't rely on fact-checking alone to catch deepfakes after they've spread. We have to think about preventative infrastructure. One major area of development is watermarking and provenance standards. And so initiatives like C2PA are creating technical frameworks to digitally label videos and images and audio at the point of creation. And I don't want to get too technical, but they're embedding metadata that shows where and how a piece of content was made. I think if we can widely adopt that, watermarking makes it easier for platforms, journalists, voters, other folks invested in this to verify authentic media and to also spot synthetic manipulation faster. But obviously adoption of that is still patchy. Most political content, ads, memes, videos, they circulate on platforms that don't consistently require a check for metadata. And regardless, determined bad actors can strip or fake metadata. So I know there's a lot of conversation around watermarking. It's a promising tool, but it's not a magic bullet. It has to be combined with public education, platform accountability, and real stronger rules about the disclosure of AI-generated political content. And then finally, I do think we have to continue building public resilience. The skepticism that we saw from voters this past election, it didn't really happen by accident or by chance. It was the product of years of hard work from election officials, civic groups, and journalists to an extent. But these efforts need to be scaled. They need to be sustained and nationalized, especially in vulnerable communities in battleground states. And then finally, I think lawmakers have to move from vague proposals to targeted enforceable standards. there's a lot of messaging bills. There's a lot of ideas kind of in the legislative scape, but broad bans or kind of sweeping speech laws won't survive constitutional scrutiny. We've seen that in California. We've seen that in some other jurisdictions. To the extent that lawmakers will get involved in this, we need content neutral, narrow legislation that requires maybe disclosure for synthetic political ads, outlawing election deepfakes, and strengthening penalties for coordinated influence operations. The key word has to be narrow, content neutral. Otherwise, I don't think it'll stand up to constitutional scrutiny and muster. And so with all that being said, I think 2024 showed us that, AI didn't, quote unquote, break democracy. But it's really bending the boundaries of what voters can trust, what bad actors can do, and really how fast misinformation can travel. The scary part, obviously, is that the tech will keep improving. The actors using it will obviously become more sophisticated. And with that, our institutions, tech platforms, elections offices, Congress, they need to keep pace. This wasn't a crisis point, but it really was an early warning. And I think the real test is whether we'll listen to it. And so with that, I'll yield the floor and turn it back over to you, Spence.
Well, thank you for those really thoughtful comments. Chris, would you like to give your opening statement now?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Spence. Hi, everyone. My name's Chris McIsaac. I'm a fellow at the R Street Institute and focused on election policy. And in particular, I've done some research on the topic of the impact of artificial intelligence on elections. So I think I'm going to use my opening time to first take a little bit of a step back and just talk about how we think about the impact of AI on elections overall, not just specific to the information environment. And then after I do that, I'll address a few of the points that have been raised regarding some of the legislative proposals and responses to the potential impacts of deepfakes and other deceptive content. But just, I think, big picture, and I wrote a report on this about a year ago. We think of the impact of artificial intelligence on elections in three main buckets, with the first being impacts on the administration of elections, the second being election cybersecurity, and then the third being really the focus of our conversation today, which is impacts on the information environment. And so going through each of those kind of one by one, I think election administration is the area where artificial intelligence holds the most promise as a potential benefit to the way that elections are conducted in the United States. In particular, you look around the country and our system is incredibly decentralized. There's over 10,000 local election jurisdictions that are responsible for, doing the actual work of putting on elections. And there are great benefits to that structure. It keeps, the day-to-day logistics close to the voters. It also prevents any hiccups from having kind of broad-ranging national impacts, right? It isolates potential challenges. But that system also creates a certain amount of inefficiency and redundancy when you have 10,000 different organizations essentially doing the same thing. So I think that's where artificial intelligence can be an incredibly useful tool just from an efficiency standpoint and helping election workers kind of more effectively do their jobs. And that can be, initially basic things like back office processes of, drafting first cuts at press releases or helping to proofread ballots before they're sent out to voters. And then kind of over time, I think you could integrate some of these tools into more election-specific processes. Like, for example, there's been some research into whether it could be used as a tool for signature verification and other kind of more specific election-related tasks. All of that, I think, is down the road, but the big picture point is that this is potentially a useful tool that can really help election workers do their jobs more efficiently. They need to do this to the extent that they're going to be incorporating these tools. There are things they need to consider around being transparent in their use and ensuring that human beings are still the ultimate decision makers when these tools are used. You're not just letting AI make decisions about a voter's eligibility to participate or whether or not a ballot is a legitimate thing that should be counted or not. Like, that still needs to be a human decision, but AI certainly holds promise to do that better over time. And I think for 2024, there wasn't a lot of this used yet. This is still early days, but again, down the road, potential benefits. On the cybersecurity front, I think they're similar to the way that there are concerns that AI could disrupt the election from a misinformation perspective. There was a significant amount of concern heading into 2024 that AI could be used to accelerate the cyber attacks that are common in terms of bad actors trying to disrupt American elections through whether it's denial of service attacks that take down election websites, or your more traditional phishing attempts to try to get campaigns to click infected links or open attachments. AI can certainly increase the capabilities of those attempts to disrupt. At the same time, the cyber defenses benefit from artificial intelligence as well. So that kind of cat and mouse game between the attackers and the defenders is going to continue, with or without artificial intelligence. And one of the key points that some of the federal cybersecurity regulators made heading into the election was that many of the same cyber defenses that we are all familiar with in terms of, double checking email addresses before you click links in an email, multi-factor authentication, having strong passwords, all of those tactics are still very useful and effective defenses against attacks, even if they come from an AI source. So again, I think, yes, AI was used in the 2024 election to launch these type of attacks, but the effectiveness of them was no better or worse than I think we see in an average election. So that brings us to the misinformation piece and the effect of AI on the information environment. And I largely agree with the overview that Abdiaziz gave on the impacts on 2024, which was that it was certainly in play, but it didn't have that disruptive impact that many feared heading into the election. But from my perspective, it did prompt a significant increase in the government's role in regulating political speech. The number of laws that states have passed in the last year or two is pretty significant. We went from 5 states having laws on the books to restrict the use of deceptive AI in political communications heading into 2024. And today, we stand at 23 that have put these laws in effect. So what that means is about nearly 60% of the population now resides in a state that is regulating the use of AI in this type of political speech in some fashion. So that's a pretty significant expansion from my perspective, and in some ways concerning. The approach that is typically being used in these restrictions are to require labeling. There's a couple states that have gone down the path of trying to just prohibit deceptive content outright, but those, most notably in California, have hit legal considerations and restrictions from the judges saying that this probably violates the First Amendment, so they've been placed on hold. But this more common approach of trying to require labeling has gained significant traction. And while those may stand on stronger constitutional grounds in terms of maybe not having the same type of restrictions on free speech, I do think it's still, from an implementation perspective, raises some pretty significant challenges for the government, even if it's constitutional, to actually, enforce these requirements and making determinations for what is true, what is false, and whether or not, the creator of the content, was intending for it to, impact the election, and all of these kind of nuanced judgment calls, rather than leaving those sort of in the realm of political debate. We're kind of forcing some of those determinations to be made in the judiciary, which I don't know that is the best use of government resources, frankly. So I'll probably leave it there and kind of transition into the conversation and questions portion. But my takeaway from 2024 is, thankfully, AI did not, have the major disruptions that many people feared. I agree that this issue isn't going away and the technology is going to continue to evolve, so we need to remain on top of it. But I do have concerns about policymakers increasingly turning to the government to be the arbiter of these nuanced decisions about truth, technology, and political debate. So I'll leave it at that. But thank you for the opportunity to make my opening statement.
Yeah, cool. So I appreciate that from both of you guys. So after the opening statements, I wanted to give you guys a chance to do open discussion, to address anything maybe specific that you heard in the opening statements. And if not, that's cool. We have a couple questions already, and I have a couple questions myself. So are there any follow-up thoughts from the panelists after the opening statements?
I think if you just let me jump in quickly.
Sure.
I think with respect to Chris's last point about being wary of kind of the regulatory or kind of the legislative process, anyways, trying to figure this out. I think I share some of that skepticism, and I think with the statistic that you shared about 23 states regulating the use of AI in some sort of fashion. I think the challenges to implementation are obviously very real. I think determining what's deceptive is kind of a messy, complicated thing, especially in fast-moving political environments, and that enforcement capacity is limited. I think state agencies will struggle to track and respond to high volumes of content. And then I think from my eyes, anyways, one of the bigger challenges is that bad actors can route through third parties or jurisdictions that are harder to regulate. And so you kind of play this kind of whack-a-mole game where you may kind of shut it down here, but it comes back somewhere else. So what's the kind of comprehensive strategy? I do think despite that, though, and this is certainly the position of the Brennan Center, is that kind of the absence of any rules would make it worse. I think without some sort of disclosure laws, from our view anyways, I think voters have no baseline way to know whether the ad they're seeing is real or synthetic. And I think without some guardrails, the kind of the use of AI, the malicious use of AI anyways, because I do think another thing I want to distinguish, which is a whole other conversation we can get into, is that there is positive uses of AI within the system, but I do think the kind of the malicious use of AI could be normalized before voters or even the courts to an extent can catch up. And so to the extent that there is regulation, and I think we may disagree on kind of the necessity for this, but I think to the extent that there is regulation, I would prefer it focuses on the clear misrepresentation of material facts like voting times, ballot information, candidate endorsements, and I think this one may be a little more tricky, but requiring disclosure when AI is materially used in political communications, which itself, like Chris recognized, it may stand on kind of stronger legal ground. Though even that, I think, is up for debate. But I think these kind of narrow, targeted laws, grounded kind of in protecting voters from fraud, not necessarily in policing ideas, may have a easier route in the courts, and like I said, it really might not. But I don't think it's an easy balance, but I do think it's essential if we want AI to enhance the process while we try to get ahead of it. And I think there's an analogy with how social media kind of came up, the government, and to an extent, I think this may be an argument for government to stay out, but the government was completely outwitted, but both in terms of technical understanding and also in terms of what the solution looked like. But yeah, that's to say, I think, Chris, I share some of your skepticism, though I think we do disagree maybe on the means.
Yeah, I'll just address a couple things there. I think the first point, I think the distinction that you raise about, misinformation that is related to the election process and, where to vote, when to vote, how to register. I think those are distinctly different issues than misinformation about candidates, right? I think, candidates in political campaigns have lied about each other forever. They're going to continue to do that. And I think it's up to the candidates and their supporters to kind of sort out what's true, what's false, and have that debate in the public square, essentially. I think the government does have more of a responsibility to, if nothing else, correct the record when there are false claims made that are designed to, get people to not participate in the process. I still don't know that a law prohibiting those type of claims or requiring a disclosure is going to be effective in addressing that. But I do think like the local election officials, the Secretary of State, law enforcement, like they all have a role to play to get the word out if there are false claims in that regard, that no, this is not, what's going on here. Check with your local election official to figure out, when, voting times are and locations, like kind of build the public awareness to go to your official government election official for those type of questions. Don't rely on whatever you hear online, like check, verify, which is different than I think getting the government involved in, like I said, mitigating disagreements between political candidates. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I think otherwise the challenges of kind of walking that line of trying to craft a restriction that is both legal from a constitutional perspective and enforceable and effective is a challenge that I think a lot of well-meaning policymakers are trying to do. I'm just a little skeptical that they're going to be able to get there and that it's going to be effective if implemented.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a little bit about, we're talking about laws that can affect this, but one of the things I've been thinking about in relation to this was the platform limitations that the AI models actually imposed. Like, I think Gemini was one of the first ones to really restrict its responses to political inquiries. For example, asking for maybe unappealing pictures of the president or political figures doing, other acts that maybe not appropriate. What effect do y'all think that had, and especially kind of like looking forward, what promise does this hold, and maybe how can we push the platforms to, as Abdiaziz, as you're saying, kind of cut this out at the root, as opposed to trying to fight the growing tree of misinformation as it buds. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I definitely think this sort of platform imposed limitations, like you said, had some positive effects, obviously because it reduced the ability to kind of easily manufacture deceptive or unflattering content of candidates. But I think the limits were uneven. I think some platforms applied the restrictions narrowly or inconsistently, and there were really still workarounds. And so, like you could say, generating generic political images or using off-platform tools that didn't impose any restrictions at all. I think, with that being said, it's promising, but they're a starting point. And I do think, and this is one thing, the Brennan Center, we put out this AI and democracy agenda. One of the things we're thinking through is, these restrictions need to be enforced transparently, so not through hidden model rules. And so users, researchers, and the public should know what's allowed, what's restricted, and why, especially around this sort of political content that touches the democratic processes, but pushing the platforms to cut that problem off at the root, like you said, means demanding stronger provenance or clearer disclosure and built-in detection mechanisms. and not just relying on banned prompts that you can easily circumvent, or hidden filters that bad actors can work around.
So greater transparency
Mhm.
from the AI models about how the models measuring your request and judging that against its limitations, and so just greater transparency from the platforms about how they're actually moderating this material. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add on this other than I think, the experimentation by the various companies to figure out, the best way to, impose these restrictions themselves if they so choose. I think that's the way to go. I'm again hesitant to, imposing any kind of government requirements on, that you must do it this way. I prefer to see kind of the competition kind of yield a solution that works best among the different options. So, but go for it. I think that's what we need is those type of innovations to emerge organically, and I think that'll be our best route moving forward.
Yeah. So maybe just jumping to the other side of that, I think the FTC this week is investigating one of these AI companies, that like an AI deepfake checker, like an AI, expose software essentially. And the FTC is saying that these softwares don't work. They're essentially no better than a coin toss. Abdiaziz, do you see these types of technological innovations as long-term solutions, or are these types of technologies just patches to a larger problem that's going to eventually need a larger policy intervention, or some other kind of major shift in the culture or the technology?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I think to answer your question first, I don't think they're long-term solutions yet. Most of these kind of deepfake detection tools, they're inconsistent, especially when dealing with high quality synthetic media. I think they often fail because they're trained on outdated data sets, and they don't generalize to new unseen AI models. And I also think the AI generation tools are improving faster than the detection tools can
Mm,
adapt. And so there's this kind of
mm,
adversarial race going on at the same
hmm
time. And so even the top performing detectors often can't reliably distinguish high quality fakes under real world conditions like compression or re-editing or platform artifacts. So I think that it's an important part of the tool set. I don't want to kind of rain on the whole parade. I do think it can
right.
remain a part of the tool set, but it can't be the backbone um, um, of election protection. I do think to an extent that the FTC it has a point in kind of in having this kind of skepticism of it. Um, but I do think in terms of like the tool set that we have, it is like a first set of tools. It can kind of help alert or maybe even prioritize moderation, but it can't be a solution, especially within the kind of election space that voters or election officials rely on alone. And so I do, like I said, I do think the FTC's skepticism is correct. But I don't think the solution is to kind of like shut these things down. I think there has to be stronger complementary
Right.
systems to complement with the detection software.
Cool. Chris, how do you see these detection softwares as part of this piece?
Yeah, a tool in the toolbox. That strikes me as the right way to think about it. And yeah, it's something that the fact that there's so much change happening so quickly, I think it would be irresponsible to kind of like take tools off the table at any point in time. I think we need to have everything kind of evolving simultaneously in the hopes that the solution emerges from that innovation, both on the detection side or from the
Right.
generation side. I think just letting that play out is the best course of action because I think whatever we're trying to regulate away or off the table, you're already kind of out of date very quickly because of the speed at which everything is developing. So I think we need to just kind of let the innovation play out and adjust with incremental changes as necessary, but nothing too dramatic too fast.
Great. Well, this is a really interesting conversation. I could keep asking questions, but we have a few audience questions here, and chat. Just keep sending these in whenever, and we'll just keep getting around to them and talking about it. So this first one says, "Did Chris say that AI could be a tool for signature verification? I thought it is already being used to help with signature verification, the Electronic Information Center, and then he provides a link to the Brennan Center." Which discusses this. So, Chris, is that right? Is AI already being used as a tool for signature verification?
I mean, I've heard of it as a kind of aspirational use of AI, but it could be that it's being piloted in some fashion. But to the extent that it's being used, I think the important thing is that it's not the final decision maker. It could be the way that I've heard it described in terms of its opportunity is as a way to kind of take an initial cut at flagging signatures that require additional review by human beings. So to the extent that that's already in place in some places, that is quite possible. But again, the important thing there is to ensure that that's not the final arbiter of what qualifies as a ballot that can be counted. We need human eyes on that as well to make the final determination. But I'll take a look at that link and chime
Okay.
in if I'm wrong.
Abdiaziz, did you have a comment on that or no? Which is fine.
I think I share what Chris said. I
Okay.
wasn't aware of it, but I think it's certainly possible. Yeah.
Sure. Sure. So our second question says, looking forward, how do you think about the threat landscape in light of recent changes in the federal government's posturing on election cybersecurity and foreign interference? For example, changes to CISA, um, ISAC, FIFT, etc.
Yeah, I think from my vantage point, I think the threat landscape is getting more dangerous. I think there's political pressure that's caused federal agencies like CISA to pull back from some of their kind of core election security monitoring activities, and so I think objectively this leaves a gap at the national level. And frankly, many state and local election officials don't have the resources, I think, to fully monitor or respond to AI driven threats or foreign interference on their own. And then at the same time, obviously, foreign actors have been pulled back, and they're adapting quickly to use AI tools to spread disinformation or to kind of sow doubt in elections. And so I think in terms of the threat landscape, I think the result is a greater risk anyways, that some of the synthetic AI content could spread faster with less detection heading into 2026 and 2028. And so I don't know the answer, but I think strengthening federal technical support, especially on cybersecurity or threat intelligence and rapid alerts is critical. And if this gap in the national level continues to exist, we're going to need some sort of investment in local election infrastructure, but that obviously is unlikely. And so I think to answer the question straightforward, I think it creates real challenges going forward.
Yeah, I think as it comes to the emerging federal role in this type of stuff, I think there's certain things where the states, I think, can step in and do certain things, like, for example, physical security of election offices or polling locations. Like, I think that's the type of thing that you could probably backfill either through, kind of private companies that can provide that service or even local law enforcement. But on the cybersecurity front, that's where it feels like the federal government is really the best positioned entity to handle that. Like, I think it would be unrealistic to, expect states or groups of states to have a clear window into cyber threats, particularly from abroad. So I think to the extent that the federal government might be stepping back, I think prioritizing that core cybersecurity function is really important, and an area that I think if states are expecting stuff to come to them, but are going to urge the federal government to keep doing other things. I think keep them focused on the cyber defenses as a priority issue.
Great, thanks, guys. So this is a good question. Assuming rules do get on the books, what would enforcement ideally look like? Active law enforcement efforts, searching for AI content, response-based enforcement. What's a practical way to enforce some of these laws?
That's a fantastic question. I think enforcement will obviously be challenging. Yeah, I think that's the first thing. It'd have to be primarily response-based and not active surveillance. And so in practice, how we see it anyways, is that election officials or state AGs or designated agencies would act when they receive a complaint or when content kind of gets flagged by voters or monitoring groups or campaigns. Investigations would focus on kind of clear violations. And so deepfakes materially misrepresenting candidates or false voting information. I think the challenge would be, and probably the challenge in any criminal case, and not criminal case, but any kind of legal case is what's the proof of intent? Was this deliberately deceptive or materially misleading, and not just satire or error? When I worked at Amazon, one of the things that I would do when we would review bills is think through, where does liability fall on this? Is there pathways for, not pathways, carve-outs for kind of satire, parody, and these sorts of things? And I think also, active surveillance of online speech would probably raise constitutional logistical problems. Response-based enforcement tied to specific harm, voter suppression, electoral fraud is far more legally defensible and practical. But I think the challenge in this is it, like I said earlier, it probably would be kind of whack-a-mole, because enforcement would have to happen after content appears. You couldn't proactively monitor the internet, nor should you anyways for every single AI image or video.
Yeah, the other thing that this, this raises is the opportunity for just extensive amounts of litigation, particularly between political campaigns, because some of the laws at the state level are set up where, yes, it's a criminal penalty, and the government needs to be the one kind of initiating the prosecution. But in most of the cases, it's a civil penalty, and basically whoever's harmed or whoever sees the deep fake that's false can initiate a lawsuit against the person who creates or distributes the content. So I mean, you can just see the kind of political gamesmanship that could go on in the courts if the campaigns are suing each other back and forth over campaign ads. So yeah, enforcement is tricky. To address the question directly about like what's the best way to do it, I don't know. I don't see a good way to handle enforcement of this, regardless of how it's structured. So that's tricky, and for others to figure out now that we've got half the country with these.
Yeah. So the next question kind of just pushes a little deeper into that and says, like, how can regulators distinguish generative AI with the intent of parody versus malicious actors without hurting free speech and protection? So I think it's kind of been discussed a little bit, but I think, no matter how you look at this law, I think something that eventually has to happen is whether it's active law enforcement or response-based, some legal authority figure is going to have to make a determination on the piece of content in question, whether it's parody, whether it's intended to deceive. So yeah, have either of you thought about some principles or ways that regulators could go about distinguishing these pieces of content?
I mean, I have, and I think it's important to recognize there's the theoretical and then there's kind of like the practical. Theoretically, I think regulators could distinguish by, looking at intent and materiality, and so they'd only, targets, I guess, for lack of a better word, target synthetic media that's designed to materially mislead voters about facts, that again becomes like, well, what's material, what's not material? I think courts already protect political satire strongly under the First Amendment. And so, you'd have, you'd protect parody if it's clearly recognized as satire, or labeled as fiction. And I think regulators would have to, like I tried to allude to earlier, be focused narrowly on specific harms, and not broadly policing all political speech. And so in short, I think satirical deepfakes, exaggerations, jokes, artistic critiques would be protected, and have already been protected under kind of existing Supreme Court case law. I think deceptive synthetic media would be regulated. Now, that's why I said there's kind of the theoretical, then there's the actual. All of this would kind of in practice, like Chris said, set off a wave of litigation that touches on almost every facet of what I said, like A, what's material, what's not material, B, what's satire, what's not satire, what disclaimer is kind of burdensome under the First Amendment, which one is not, what's narrowly tailored, is kind of legislating on voter suppression the same as legislating on election fraud. Is there a kind of like a right to, I guess, voter suppress under political speech? Like, these are kind of like really challenging questions that courts have to answer. I think from our position, I think the courts should have some sort of role in kind of figuring out, what some of the answers to these questions are. I don't know where they would fall on that spectrum, but I do think, like, in any kind of a statute or proposed legislation or even regulation that goes into effect, every bit of it would be scrutinized, and has kind of like a live litigious issue within it. So I think there's a theory. I think practically it's so much more challenging.
Yeah, one other thing I would add on this that could be instructive is the Federal Election Commission was exploring potential regulations around the use, exactly what we're talking about, the use of AI to engage in essentially fraudulent misrepresentation, I believe is the term of art within their sphere of regulations. And where they came down was essentially that they didn't impose a new rule that was specific to the use of AI in that fashion, but they issued what I believe the term was essentially a guidance that if you can commit an act that is already like fraudulent under our existing rules and you use AI to do it, like that still qualifies as fraudulent misrepresentation. So it's more focused on the activity as opposed to the technology used to commit the activity. So that could be something for states to, explore if they feel the need to do something in this space, is to see if there are other laws already on the books related to fraud that perhaps you could just piggyback on that and say, yeah, fraud in this election context is already prohibited. Therefore, if you use AI to do this, it's still going to be a problem for you. So I think, piggybacking on existing law could be a way to follow some existing paths toward how to enforce using, past experiences in other contexts.
Yeah, so I'll just add in there, I guess maybe there are like libel, slander, defamation, like there are certain principles that are used to determine the truth and falsity of those things and what like damages actually occurred. And then there are actually like stricter standards for political speech. And so I wonder if maybe we can port, as you're saying, Chris, kind of like port some of those principles over, and clarify that they do apply to AI generated content, but maybe we don't need like new definitions of like malicious and what, maybe we can borrow from existing law to get the outcome that we want, which is good quality, civic conversation. Do either of you see that as a possibility? Are legislators talking about this?
Well, I think, just one of the, I think, motivations for all of the legislation is there is public pressure on lawmakers to do something about deepfakes and AI. So yeah, I mean, even if you could rely on some laws on the books, that doesn't address the kind of incentive to an elected official to take action by passing a law. So I think the short answer is yes, I think it's worth exploring and there could be ways to do it, but it doesn't deal with the political incentive to, address problems by passing a law, which is
Right,
elected officials
right.
elected to do.
So we have one more question challenging the idea that the courts should be the one deciding whether the material is deceptive or whatever. They're hard pressed to believe that courts would be better equipped than legislators who are actually involved in the campaign. So what do you make of that, the court versus the legislature determining the rules for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, courts shouldn't be designing election policy in general. I think that's the job of legislators. But I think the point I was trying to make is that obviously under the Constitution, courts are the ones who have to review any law that touches or will review any law that touches political speech to make sure it doesn't violate the First Amendment. And so I don't think it's about whether courts are better equipped to understand campaigns. I think it's about the kind of the theoretical role they play within our constitutional order, which is protecting against, overly broad or vague restrictions on speech, even if the law is well-intentioned. And from my vantage point, obviously lawmakers and legislators who are close to campaigns are better positioned to draft laws that reflect real world problems, but they still have to draft narrowly, targeting clear, provable harm, because otherwise courts will strike those laws down for overbreadth. And so, the court's role isn't to improve law. I think it's to make sure that the laws that regulate political speech don't cross constitutional lines. And so in saying all that, it's inevitable that, whatever provisions of law that are passed by, state legislators will end up in the courts. And recognizing that they will end up in the courts, I think the paradigm that we look and most likely will have to look through any bill text is if it's narrowly tailored, if it serves a compelling government interest, and if it does not necessarily burden protected speech. And I think courts will have to check that, any legislative solution to make sure anyways it's respecting constitutional boundaries.
Right. So it'll be maybe less about determining the actual content and more about whether the government has compelling interest and whether, constitutional boundaries are being met. So that's kind of where the court would come in versus the legislature.
Precisely.
Cool. So while we have a couple minutes left, we just had another question. In preparation for upcoming elections, can think tanks like R Street educate communities in battleground states to be smart about how they consume information? So essentially, can think tanks help educate people to be aware of these things and to prevent misinformation? I don't want to do a plug for my answer would be yes, of course. Everyone should read our website. Everyone watching this, everyone listening, should read R Street and the Brennan Center. There's think tanks are awesome. So the answer to that is yes. But
Yeah,
what do
I
the
can give
panelists
a
think?
specific example. Yeah, just in the lead up to the last election, we published a short piece that kind of went through what can you expect on election day in, I think it was 4 or 5 of the battleground states, in terms of getting ahead of like some of the narratives that could emerge from an election administration perspective, and to kind of say, okay, well, yeah, it's going to take Arizona a little bit longer to count their ballots because of these factors that are built into their system. So just because they're slow to count doesn't mean that there's fraud going on or anything out of the ordinary. So I think, yeah, kind of getting ahead of some of those potential areas of misinformation that could emerge is useful. And I think think tanks can certainly play a role in that, but it extends beyond that. Of course, the election officials can work to get ahead of,
Right.
here's our process, here's how we count ballots, here are the steps involved. And being transparent about that can all help, I think, dispel some of the issues that can prop up in the absence of that type of info.
Cool. So with just a few minutes left, we'll see if another question pops in, but moderator's prerogative. I wanted to ask about this whole, as part of my research, I wanted to ask about this community notes innovation. And again, this is sort of like a post hoc, the misinformation is already out there. So I understand this isn't like a, a pre solution or whatever. But from my research and the research I've read, community notes is maybe slow, but it's very effective in adding context. So what, getting back to the core question of the panel, like what, what did the panelists think were some reasons that misinformation wasn't bigger? Was it community notes? Was it resilient communities? So like maybe to close out, just an answer from each of you about maybe like the one or two main reasons why you think that misinformation coming from both of your introduction wasn't a blowout thing like many people thought it would be. Like, let's just close by giving the core answers. Like in my mind, I see community notes as a big one, right? Like it's a very effective tool in helping combat those things. But I want to hear from you guys to close what you think are your main reasons for why that the misinformation or deepfakes didn't really crash the election the way they thought we would, or some people thought they would.
I'll be super quick. I think, like you said,
Sure.
I think community notes was great. I think it kind of created crowdsourced corrections to misinformation. I think the only limits that came is, they depend on consensus, kind of, which can be slow. And they only cover certain platforms, so there's gaps elsewhere. I think to kind of answer your question directly, is, public skepticism was higher, public awareness was higher. I think community notes and things of that nature helped with kind of the awareness of the public. I think election officials and civic groups were better prepared. I think the tech platforms responded a bit faster than in past cycles, and I think some bad actors may have held back, to be honest with you. But that's kind of my bird's eye view.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with that. The two things to summarize it, I would say that the public was on the defensive and were, consuming information with a healthy dose of skepticism, in part because there was so much attention paid to this issue leading up to the election. And then I think number two, I think the technology is just not quite there. It's very powerful, it's impressive, but it wasn't quite where it needed to be to overcome all of the other kind of factors that were at play during the election.
So Donald Trump and Joe Biden playing Call of Duty together maybe wasn't convincing enough for people to really buy into it. But what I hear is that we're kind of developing a culture of skepticism of digital information because of this, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it seems like it's so far been, I think we could conclude, moderately to somewhat effective in terms of keeping the lid on this problem. And Abdiaziz points out, I mean, it's the fight's not over. This technology is going to evolve. The problem is going to evolve. But I do find it encouraging that some of these predictions didn't come true. I'm encouraged by the platform's responses to this, and as Abdiaziz also mentioned, there's probably more transparency and some improvements that could be made there. But overall, yeah, a fascinating conversation and a great breakdown of the election and some future prospects. So if the panelists don't have any closing statements, or if you guys have anything else you'd like to throw out, we can do that now. But if not, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and thank you for all these really, really thoughtful, good questions. Those were really helpful, and yeah, thank you to both the panelists for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you,
Thanks
guys.
very much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.